We are studying the chapter titled The Ladder of Self-Transcendence in the Synthesis of Yoga. And briefly, to recall the context, he has in earlier chapters described the planes of consciousness that make up the world and their corresponding subtle sheaths in the human evolving person. And in the immediate previous chapter, we saw how it is possible for us to shift the poise of our consciousness from identification with the physical sheath to the vital sheath and then to the mental sheath. The experience then is that we are this mind awareness in a mind body which has powers and capacities extending as if out into the cosmic mind, while also containing within us the vital sheath and the physical body as instruments through which we are able to act in the material domain, even while we can more freely act in the mental domains. But none of this really frees us into the fullness of the Spirit. This chapter focuses on this one objective. How does this lower triple domain, so different from the Spirit and its oneness and its full power, how does this open out to that? And what is the relationship between that and this? That's why self-transcendence. And each of these planes is as if a step in the ladder of self-transcendence. This breaking out into those higher realms is in fact something which is considered very difficult in our normal evolution. There is a huge separation. He says, a separation acute in practice, though unreal in essence, divides the total being of man, the microcosm, as it divides also the world being, the macrocosm. And he describes how the whole world is as if made of a higher hemisphere and a lower hemisphere of the ancient wisdom. In the higher hemisphere, consisting of the Sat, Chit, Ananda, and its creative power of the supramental, which bridges the two hemispheres, in that higher hemisphere is the full, perfect reign of the Spirit. It manifests itself freely, all its infinities, all its possibilities of existence flow in their infinities without limit. The consciousness, knowledge, force, power, beatitude, everything there is illimitable, always perfect and eternal. And so it is the domain of the reign of the Spirit. Spirit rules freely. On the other hand, the lower half is as if the very opposite. Here, also, it belongs to the Spirit because Spirit is one. But here, Spirit is veiled, closely veiled, thickly veiled, and so when it tries to express itself through these veils, he describes three great veils. The limiting mind, confined life, dividing body. And we dwelt on the sense of this mind already when we think, and not just the cosmic mind, just our thinking mind, but even the cosmic mind is as if limiting. It puts everything within limits, puts everything within finites. Everything we know is always a finite. Maybe a huge finite, but still a finite. Unlike that, in the upper half, where everything is infinite, nothing is finite, nothing is limited, and as infinite, it can go on pouring out unendingly and never end. Here in the mind, it always has a limit, limiting mind. When it moves from there through the layer, the veil of the vital life energy. There it is confining life. Life force is bound inside, but unable to go beyond its boundaries. Mind, at least, can stretch. Here, the elasticity is limited. Everything is bound into its limitations and unable to go beyond that boundary. And the last step in the veil of matter and the body itself, dividing. Everything is fundamentally separate. This is separate from that. And the two can collide. You can place them together and squeeze them, but they can never become one. You can glue them together, but if you pull them hard enough, they will still separate because they only pretended to be one. They were never really one. Of course, you could crush them and then they become powder and mix the powder and make one, but then they are never able to experience their separation. They are broken, they are lost, they are destroyed in the process. In the vital energy, though, you could bring two beings close enough and the vitality can infuse from one to the other, as happens in couples, in families, in small clans, tightly knit. But still, there is a boundary outside which it is not I. In the mind, the infusion can be even more free because your mind can easily lean into the mind and worldview of another person, and then another person, and another person, and freely shift across them all. So, what you see is as you come down, there is a narrowing, limiting, and a fixity of division. As you rise up, the rigidity blends, becomes more free, more fluid, opens out. But still, in the highest ranges of the lower hemisphere, you have some kind of limit. It is only in the upper hemisphere that you have the full infinity. When this happens, that in the lower hemisphere things are reduced, even if flexibly, it has immediate consequences. And this is what he has listed, which we also read last time. The self in the lower hemisphere is shrouded in name and form. Its consciousness is broken up by the division of internal and external. At the very least, you realize, even in the free mind, your awareness is my thinking versus someone else's thinking. And while I may identify with the other person's thinking, there is still a basic difference between mine and not mine. So there is the internal and external difference. Individual and universal, that which belongs into the universal, is the space in which my individual moves, but they are fundamentally different. There is an experience in which the universe and the individual are actually one, belongs to the upper hemisphere properly and not in the lower hemisphere. Then, as a result, he says, its vision and sense are turned outward. Everything is now focused on the other with which you have to deal. So, universe, individual being separate. Now, individual lives or acts in universe, and so the whole turn is outward to the universe. All the causes of my problems are outside me, all the solutions seem to be outside me, and all my action and my life is in how I engage with the universe in relation to I. And then, as a result, again, its force limited by division, its consciousness works in fetters, its knowledge, will, power, delight, divided by the division, limited by limitation, are open to the experience of their contrary or perverse forms. The moment you have had these divisions, knowledge has to meet its limitation and its separation, and therefore error of knowledge, ignorance of knowledge, weakness, suffering, all these follow as a chain. So, as it appears in the very manner in which the lower hemisphere is formed, you cannot avoid ignorance, weakness, suffering. In the most of the Vedantic traditions, the whole focus is on this sense of ignorance. You want to be free of ignorance? The only way is you get out of this lower hemisphere into the upper. Or in the ascetic traditions or in the Buddhist tradition, the focus is much more on the suffering. You want to be free of suffering? Well, you have to get out of all this which belongs to the relative domains. You have to go into the absolute out of relativity. Then only you can be free of suffering. And then Sri Aurobindo says, yes, you can be aware of things which are deeper. We can indeed become aware of the true self or spirit in ourselves by turning our sense and vision inward. Similarly, you can become aware of the spirit or self in others by as if penetrating through the appearances, through the veil of names and forms to that which is behind or within. But with all this inward perception, what you gain at best, he says, is this inward look may become by reflection aware of the infinite being, consciousness, and delight of the self, and share in its passive or static infinity of these things. So, because you are receiving in the inward look by reflection, your need is to be in a state of complete stillness. How will the water reflect the sky or the sun if it is in agitation? In order to be able to reflect perfectly something which is other than itself, it must become completely still. And in that case, what does it reflect? It reflects only the stillness of that. So the reflection experienced in these inner states of that consciousness, being, delight, will still be passive, static, unchanging. And only to a very limited extent, the dynamic energy and power of those domains can be a little bit perhaps brought into expression, but a little bit only. And even this little bit cannot be normally attained without a very difficult, long process of evolution, growth, etc. Because our consciousness is so firmly fixed in the lower hemisphere of being. And this is what we had read last time. And so the concluding part of that discussion was to understand the possibility of transcending it all, we must restate in a practical formula the relations of the worlds which constitute the two hemispheres. And this is what is going to be the rest of the chapter. Now, as a practical formula, he is going to show you what happens. What happens when from the lower realms we begin to become conscious not only of the higher realms of the lower hemisphere, but try to reach the higher hemisphere? What is the relationship from matter, and then from the vital world, and then from the mental world, and then from something still higher? And what we will see in the sequence as we go up, each has its own experience or limitation of experience of the upper hemisphere. But as you go up, that limitation becomes less and more free, more complete, though not it yet, but still, until we are able to come not only in the domain of the mind, where you might have experiences of that, but still with limitations. The light of that can fully flood down, but there's always some limitation. And then there'll be a last step in which we are able to ascend to the supramental consciousness, which alone can know that fully while still being bridged with the mind, life, and matter. And at that point, you have the possibility to fully express that upper hemisphere into the lower hemisphere. What we will see, and I'm anticipating because we will not have time to see the whole chapter today, it will take several days to go in depth, but it's useful to have the big picture. As we identify, first he says, as we identify with the physical consciousness, your entire sense of I is body, and you have as if emerged out of body and end with body. But with that, as you turn to the higher spiritual possibilities, you might have a sense of the spirit, but necessarily it will be a silent and passive self that you can attain. Because and he will see the logic of it. That's in the physical consciousness, the soul has to stand back from matter, from prakriti, from nature, in order to be able to recognize that there is something more. As long as you're identified with the physical consciousness, it looks as if you are formed by a body. You are formed by material world and nature. To experience something more, you separate. And in the act of separation, you are Purusha. still, silent, quiet awareness. And therefore, its access to things higher also is as quiet, silent, still. And you see the divine only as silence, stillness, peace. If you go up now to the vital, now you identify yourself with the vital energy, with the vital consciousness. You're formed of this life force. At that point, of course, you can have extraordinary, greater freedom and capacities, but he explains how if you stop there, even with the development of mind and opening to the spirit, but from the vital, it creates a very peculiar type of energy and drive, and even a tapasya, which is almost asuric. And he explains how that forms because of the very nature of the vital limitation. But from there, when you open to the higher upper half, upper hemisphere, a greater possibility of dynamism is expressed, but still in the limitations of the vital division. And so what is expressed is distorted, and yet something of it can come through. When you rise to mind, you are much closer now to the secret origin of things. Spirit poised in mind is now much more plastic, much more free, able to lift to still higher ranges within mind. And there he becomes capable of experiencing things as if half divine now. But still, the material through which it is expressed has its limitation. And from the mind consciousness, if you seek to experience the things of the upper hemisphere, you have as if the passage into the beyond from which you can never return. Because of the nature of the mind, that limits, to go into something beyond limits means you cannot come back into limits. Limits are shattered. How do you come back then? And so it seems, and you will see the justification for all the spiritual conclusions of many great traditions that say, once you cross those gates, you don't come back. And we've all heard this. It is so deeply embedded in the spiritual traditions. But it's only true as long as you, as conscious being, have identified with mind as I. But if you shift that identification one more level and identify with the supramental. So that's what he says here. The limitation is true only so long as man remains closed within the boundaries of the mental maya. If he rises into the self, knowledge self, beyond the highest mental stature, if he becomes the knowledge soul, the spirit poised in gnosis, and puts on the nature of its infinite truth and power, then now you're living in the next sheath, the causal sheath. Then only he would be able to draw down entirely into his terrestrial existence the fullness of the infinite spiritual consciousness. Only then will he avail to raise his total being and even his whole manifested, embodied, expressive nature into the spiritual kingdom. So two things happen when you are poised there as spiritual, as supramental self. At that point, the full possibilities of the higher can flow down into the lower, and the capacities of the lower consciousness can be lifted into the upper, and the division between the upper hemisphere and the lower hemisphere is healed. And this is why to poise ourselves as supramental being is the reference for the perfection which the divine seeks to manifest in the universe. Short of that, it appears in the mind as if that is not possible because the division can never be healed. Going lower, it feels as if you can live in a spiritual stillness and silence, but its power and its joy and the infinity of its play and the delight of the infinity of its play are beyond reach. But when you reach the supramental station, then all of that infinity can manifest here with full power, full freedom, and the delight of the play. That's why this is so important. The lack of this or the loss of this is the cause of all the traditions saying, not possible. Spirituality must separate, must go beyond by abandoning or separating from the lower half. This is the reason why Sri Aurobindo and the mother even use the phrase supramental yoga, because at some point the yoga itself takes on this form of stationing the consciousness in a supramental consciousness. All the rest is really preparation for that. And that's why Sri Aurobindo worked so hard and the mother worked so hard to bring down that supramental consciousness into the lower hemisphere as an active power. He will explain at the end of the chapter that the supramental principle is secretly lodged in all existence. It's even here in the lower hemisphere. It's there even in the grossest materiality, veils itself and so on, yet its governing presence in the lowest forms assures us that there is a possibility of their awakening, a possibility even of their perfect manifestation. So, if there is something of this domain of this upper hemisphere and the supramental working and concealed in body, in the physical world, in life energy, in mind, if it is there concealed, then it means it can act. And the logic goes one more step. He says, and what is possible must one day be, for that is the law of the omnipotent spirit. Very important insight here. If something is possible, it has to be. Because spirit is all powerful. Because it is all powerful, it is able to do whatever it chooses freely. And if right now something is concealed but possible to be expressed, well, one day it has to be. Now, all of this, when he wrote, Sri Aurobindo wrote this in, let's say, about 1916, 1917, in the Arya and some of the chapters later on. He describes this awakening to the supramental consciousness as something exceedingly difficult. And that is why the whole effort of their work was to bring that force as an active aid in the lower hemisphere. And if it can once be released here, once it begins to flow freely in the mind, vital and physical, however concealed, but now freely working from behind appearances, not only our effort is aided by its presence, but also that it can guide, it can awaken in us a call even without our realizing it. So, a monkey, for example, without realizing it, will feel the tendency of the mind and impulse to know awakening in him because the mind is already active. And if he meets a human being, that whole process might be aided by the human contact. But the fact that it is there as a force and active makes it inevitable that this awakening will take place. And so this was achieved in 1956. That supramental consciousness, which was so far bridging the upper hemisphere and the lower hemisphere as a domain, as a world, as a power in itself, was released and brought down into the lower hemisphere. And the mother, you recall the whole experience she describes, standing before this gigantic golden door with a hammer, golden hammer, and breaking it. But if you remember the wording, she says something like this, that I had a form bigger than the universe. How do you conceive of that? A form bigger than the universe. Obviously, it is not in the physical universe. It's not in the lower hemisphere. It is stationed in that supramental domain. There, the action took place and the downpour came. And then, of course, she says what descended was the supramental light and force, but not its, and consciousness, but not its power. And but already this having come, the power is already there, and it's a question of time for its full unveiling. And that's why she says a day will come when even the most blind will be forced to recognize it, because it's working inevitably, will now fulfill itself. Again, we come to the logic, because spirit is omnipotent. Once it is active here, there is nothing which can oppose eventually. Even in principle, there is nothing which can oppose if it chooses to accelerate, but Too much of an acceleration may overwhelm or break something which is too rigid, too slow, too resistant. So it, in its total wisdom, makes as fast a change as possible without breaking of the work done. And this is where we are at today in the human evolution. As a result of that event, as a result of the active presence of the supramental consciousness working in the world, what Sri Aurobindo has described here as difficult in the extreme becomes not only less difficult, but also inevitable. Still, as an experience, as one develops the access to the higher ranges of consciousness, to enter the supramental world itself and that state may be difficult in the extreme in relation to the normal experiences we have. Nevertheless, something has fundamentally shifted and changed after 29th of February 1956. And I'm deliberately highlighting this here because tomorrow is the anniversary of that occasion. And it helps us to place in context that event and its importance and why the golden day is important for us as an anniversary. It is an occasion for that which took place on that day to take place within us, however partially, or prepare its emergence in us if we open ourselves with the necessary receptivity and self-giving. And so these occasions, although they have a symbolic value, they have also extreme practical value. Our mind's understanding and our heart's opening and participation can greatly help that state of receptivity and openness that would allow the descent and the action to be more effective in us. And then all of this is now put in context of the text. What was the change taking place? Who are you as a conscious soul? We start with I am body. We shift to I am life force, shift to I am mind, and at some point you shift to I am supermind. That shift of what I am as a conscious being, soul, center of awareness, is what is described in this chapter, the ladder of self transcendence. And from each, the full vision of how we relate to the higher ranges all the way to the upper hemisphere. So the first couple of paragraphs dwell on the poise of the spirit, soul in matter. All, he says, we read some of this last time, but we review it. All is determined by the spirit. For all, from the subtlest existence to grossest matter, is manifestation of the spirit. So first change we bring in our mind. We no more think of that as different and other than this. All this is one spirit. You may use the formula Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahman. All this verily is the divine. And all this is not merely limiting to the physical world, but in your conception, the planes, the vital worlds, the mental worlds, and beyond, and beyond, and beyond. The picture he gave right at the beginning of the chapter was that as we ascend, breaking beyond the boundary, it opens out a hierarchy of infinitudes to which the normal existence of man, even in its highest and widest flights, is still a stranger. The wording stranger is very suggestive. If you were to wander there, first of all, you don't belong there. So you find it difficult to enter as a stranger. But equally, the beings of that world look at you and say, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You don't quite fit. But as a stranger, you cannot relate to and station yourself there. There's always something missing, some link missing. If you recall a very interesting experience Huta narrates, When mother wanted her to paint some of the experiences of the higher worlds, she wanted her to have the experience before painting. So, with the extraordinary capacity she had, she could take you where she wanted on any domain, any plane. She took Huta to each of the lower worlds and then took her to the supramental world at one point. And Huta says, I found myself floating in this world. Everything was golden and beautiful in whatever way she registered it. But I found myself floating. I could not put my feet on the ground. That's the way she registered the gap, something missing, something unable to tangibly fix there. And when she asked the mother about it, mother said, yes, it'll take you a few lifetimes to get to that point, but you will get it someday. But the idea behind this is when you're there, you are not yet ready. You do not belong there. And so there is always some gap, some disconnect. And yet you can have an experience, a glimpse of it. I will put it in another way, the same experience in a different context. Mother did it to Huta because she had to paint. But what prevents her from giving us that experience? In principle, no reason, except our readiness, perhaps, or the utility or the ability to perceive that world. So when Huta entered it, she perceived it within her limited capacity of perception. So everything gets reduced to that. You take a blind man to see a beautiful exhibition of flowers, he can smell the perfumes, but he cannot see the colors, isn't it? And it's something like this. You enter the supramental consciousness. In a finite consciousness, you enter the supramental world. What do you experience? You do not experience infinities. Of course, you feel, you sense. Everything is so vast, so enormous, so overwhelming, and so beautiful, indescribably perfect. And yet, you cannot experience as it actually is. It is all reduced to your blindness. Let's put it that way. And so these glimpses at best can be an aid. Sri Aurobindo actually describes these domains in Savitri. You read them, you find as if a part of you is uplifted and opens to something greater. It prepares the mind and so on. But so the work for us is to build the base sufficiently that she can lift us when she chooses, and we are able to receive and experience more completely. And that's why, in the nature of the yoga, since we rely on her grace and her action as the divine Shakti, as the supramental Shakti, we can be sure that the experience will be given and we can work on the preparation for it. So, as an aside, we come back to this. Everything is manifestation of the Spirit. And so we keep this perspective in mind. All is Spirit. And therefore, nothing here preventing you from knowing that. Nothing that which is out of reach of your consciousness. It's only a question of veils and perceptions and evolution of your consciousness and capacities. So, but the spirit self or being determines the world it lives in and the experiences of its consciousness, force, and delight in that world by some poise among many possible of the relations of Purusha and Prakriti, soul and nature, some basic poise in one or other of its cosmic principles. So it's a bit technical, but the concept is simply this, that the relationship of the consciousness and the energy of consciousness can be many. We will recall there were 6 different relationships, and the lowest of these relationships is where the consciousness feels itself overwhelmed by the energy, by nature, by the process, and it is so overwhelmed that it thinks that it has no existence of its own except by energy moving to form it. And this is the nature of the material world. I exist because I have a body. I exist because my heart is beating. I exist because there are electrical waves in my brain. Shut these down and I won't exist. Or so it feels. That is one relationship of I, consciousness, with nature, energy. There's another relationship where this I can separate and say, I am not energy, I am not brainwave, I am not thought, I am not emotion. And separating itself, it sees these. There's a gap. It says, I am free, I can choose. I can choose to pay more attention to this, to the brainwave or to the emotions. I can choose to pay more attention to positive emotion instead of negative emotion. And so while nature is doing her thing, the soul can focus on the positive, let's say. And interestingly, at that point, what happens is nature changes. Nature begins to express more of positive, less of negative. You choose to focus on the negative, nature gives you more of negative, less of positive. And so we discover that although the Purusha is separate, it has some kind of an influence. And that's a different relationship now. Then we discover the Purusha can also exercise a will and says, I want that more, less of that. Not merely in where it pays attention, but actively asking, willing, demanding, which is what we do, for example, in our relationship with the hand. If you say, my hand is shaking, I can't help it. That's how it is. Or your mind can stand back, I don't want it to shake, and exert a will and bring it to stability and create a new habit and a new rhythm. That reversal now takes place where the power of the soul asserts itself on its energy, on nature. And a reversal begins, but within limitations. And so, through a series of such steps, the soul rises to its own freedom, and nature now becomes its conscious power and free action. In the highest, where the soul is free, nature flows or energy flows out of him into action. Now, this is to describe various relationships possible. And so the lowest is the domain of matter. Each of the successive levels you'll find the soul becomes more free. On this he explains as what forms a whole world. If you enter the dream state in the vital worlds, in your vital body, you often have this experience that you're floating. It just happens. And then you say, I'm floating and I want to fly. You exercise a will and then you start moving. You don't know how, but it just happens. The will, the intention is enough to do it. But sometimes you drop below that level of the relationship of your soul with nature. You drop below that level and you say, I want to move, but I feel everything is resistant. I want to run, but I'm as if moving slowly against enormous there. That slight shift is this transition from a domain close to matter to a domain of the vital. And it gives you example of how an entire world is built from that grade of relationship between soul and nature. Some basic poise in one or other of its own cosmic principles. So again here the idea is the universe itself is formed by so many principles. There is, and these are described as seven, there is the principle of, let's say, existence, everything exists. Principle of consciousness, everything is conscious. Principle of delight, or principle of force. Now, all of these form the upper worlds. But in the lower worlds, we have the same principles as if reversed in sequence. Mind is awareness, but now not as free awareness, but organizing awareness of pieces. It arranges. So it's a principle of arrangement, putting in a relationship. Vital is now a principle of forces, moving, pulling, pushing, and assembling or moving generally. The physical is the equivalent of the existence, but here it is resistance in form. Form is rigid, form binds. It's the principle of form. So we have three principles above, three principles below, and then the supramental, which is the organizing principles for the whole thing. So, in a sense, any cosmos would not be cosmos if it does not have these seven principles. If you remove any one of them, everything else becomes somehow incomplete or unstable or disorganized. So, the idea of principles here is when the divine manifests, there are certain powers, certain aspects, certain principles on which, through which it acts. Any of these one principles you could take, and you could take secondary principles or tertiary principles, and make that the prime focus of the experience, and it will become a world in itself. So, the vital world is the principle of energies and forces. Become conscious of yourself as purely energies and forces, and everything as energy and forces, and you have the vital world. But into this, you could take an aspect, the energy of attraction, of love, affinity, and it would be a sub world of the vital world. The energy of chaos, agitation, and it would be another sub world within the vital. The energy of, let's say, freshness, energy of dullness, and these would become different worlds. Any quality of energy you could take and concentrate on that and live in that alone, and it becomes as if an experience of an entire world in itself. And this is the reason why, as you go up the broad steps of the planes of consciousness, in each plane there are an infinity of worlds, because every possibility, every experience, every quality of consciousness and force and substance is there as an entire infinite world in itself. And this is where you find all the imaginations of poets, writers, artists, and anything you could imagine, you will find somewhere a world of that type. All these worlds, as if, have an influence on the lowest of these worlds in matter, because all these mind vital are as if bound inside matter. So, in the material world, you can look at those worlds and imitate and give form, as in a painting or in an experience, but mostly they don't last or they become greatly dimmed, which makes it possible in the physical world that you can, for example, go in a huge, let's say, theme park. We go to section 1, where it is a theme park of fairyland. You go to section 2, it is theme park of underwater creatures. Section 3, we go to desert life. You can experience everything that could exist in those worlds in the material domain in a finite, limited zone. And so everything is as if bound in domain of form, which is the character of the material world, reduced and yet represented somehow. That's why the physical world is so potentially capable of representing anything. And if it can represent these lower worlds, it can in principle represent those higher worlds, infinities. But how? It needs something to link. That's where the supramental comes. But so far, our evolution has only gone through the first three broadly domains and not gone beyond. And so only these three, or possibilities of these three worlds, are represented. So all of this is to explain what he's describing here as worlds, poise of soul in nature, which creates worlds. And in each of these, there are experiences of consciousness, force, and delight, which define the quality or character of that world. So let's say we come down to the most material world, physical, this domain where we are touching objects, our body is my consciousness. What happens to the character of the delight here? Delight is concealed, it's hidden, because everything is bound in form. So the flower in itself will not give me delight, but maybe some interaction, the smell is nice, and a partial delight. Or suddenly the smell is too intense, it's stinging, it hurts. My delight is gone or warped, concealed. And so the delight is so deeply concealed inside form that it's as if we are chasing after formal experiences to extract pieces of delight, but can never hold. That's the nature of the physical world. In the vital world, it may be very different because there the forms are not rigid. And so, flower and its perfume will be as if permeating the whole environment. Your capacity to receive and contain is also larger. And so, I can have an intense garden of flowers overwhelming my senses in the vital world, and I can still find it greatly enjoyable. But equally, if I don't like it, I will intensely suffer its impact. Everything becomes exaggerated in intensities. And that's the nature of the vital world. And the mental similarly will have a quality. As you look at flower, you will sense not its life force, but the beauty and perfection in which the life energy is organized in the idea of flower. And so I will look at this flower and say, oh, this is literally, it represents the quality of organized action. This represents harmony. That represents something else. You will see the names of the flowers very interestingly capture a quality which you can put in terms of a mental idea. And in the mental world, it will be these that you will experience. And that is your reality. That is the domain that the world is formed of. So, this is just to give a quick summary sense of how our consciousness in relation to nature and the relationship set makes for our existence and the way we can experience consciousness, force of consciousness, and delight of consciousness. As you go up, these three become more and more free. As you go down, these three become more and more bound and hidden. So, this is the idea here. Some basic poise in one or other of its own cosmic principles. Spirit is living in that, and that becomes the world. Now, he takes the example poised in the principle of matter. It, spirit, becomes the physical self of a physical universe in the reign of a physical nature. So, when the spirit takes that position, form, rigidity of form, and you have the experience of the physical universe. I'm going to change the picture a little bit just so we get a fuller understanding. In the divine consciousness, all possible relations, all possible experiences are simultaneously present. All gradations, all degrees, all finenesses, all densities, all forces, all consciousnesses, all delights, and all interactions of delights, all simultaneously present. That's what makes the totality of cosmos. But it's chaos, not cosmos. Everything is there, piled in, pell mell. Then we realize things which are similar tend to interact with each other. So rigid form interacts with rigid form. My hand holds rose, but my hand does not interact with my idea, which is not rigid form. Hand cannot catch idea, hand can catch form of idea. So automatically there is the experience of interaction between things which are similar. Similar principle, similar density, similar quality of consciousness or force or delight. So it's as if in the total chaos of all possibilities, there is an automatic sifting in the experience, creating as if bands of worlds. But actually, everything is everywhere at the same time. But in the experience, they interact and they form, coagulate, so to say, to form so many worlds and bands or gradations. So, flower interacts with bee on a physical level, but idea of flower interacts with idea of bee in the mental world. Life force of flower interacts with life force of bee in the vital world, but life force of bee does not interact with physical flower except very indirectly, in a very limited way. Idea of bee barely interacts, but subtly. And so there's a sifting of levels. And that's what he is describing here. When spirit poises itself in matter, focuses on this aspect, and suddenly this is all you experience. What do you experience? Physical self of a physical universe and everything is material nature and habit of material nature. It is, spirit is then absorbed in its experience of matter. It is dominated by the ignorance and inertia of the tamasic power proper to physical existence. Everything is dulled, everything is heavy, everything has to be dragged and pulled against resistance. And in this is spirit. What happens to the individual? In the individual, it becomes a materialized soul. Annamaya Purusha. Anna is matter, literally food. Maya, of the nature of matter. Purusha, soul. Materialized soul whose life and mind have developed out of the ignorance and inertia of the material principle and are subject to their fundamental limitations. So when I say I am this conscious person in the material world, my life and mind have developed out of body, biology, process of matter. And so subject to whatever limitations exist in matter, which is what? That inertia, that ignorance, resistance. And so everything here, even my thought process, experiences inertia, resistance, and of course, life energy. The moment I wake up and start doing activity, the body acts like a drag on life force. And while at first I'm fresh because I have more energy, the drag is continuously draining. And by the end of the day, I have barely enough energy to stand. And I collapse and go to sleep. Regenerate energy. How? Separating from the physical body to draw energy from the vital world in the vital body and then replugging myself into the physical body. Now with more energy. And so again fresh, but again the body drags, draws, weakens, reduces, so that I need to separate and reconnect. Now, if this burden of physical inertia was not there, you could continuously draw energy. You would never get tired, as is the case in the vital world, as is in the case in the mental world. You don't need to sleep there. You're always awake, you're always active, isn't it? The need for sleep belongs to the physical world because of this inertia. So everything which is formed in the physical world and the physical soul, everything is subject to characteristics of matter, and what follows is a chain of inevitabilities. The body tires, the body ages. Given enough time, the body dies because it is so rigid it is unable to change. Shift up one level into the vital world or mental world or any of the higher ranges. Material is plastic. Physical world is rigid matter because of inertia. Their material is plastic. You don't age. In the vital body, you don't age. When you leave the physical body and you are in the physical body may have been aged. It is, let's say, drooping and cannot hold its own weight and so on. You come out of the physical body in your vital body. It takes naturally the shape of your conception of yourself. I'm young, I feel young. And so often it happens when people have passed on immediately after, and the family members meet them in dream state, they see them in their younger form because that's the nature of the vital body. It does not have the age. Of course, it can choose to shape itself to appear older, but it will not feel older. It's just the form it has taken, but the vitality will be of youth because vitality is the free truth of that domain. In the physical world, vitality is subject to inertia, which is pulling down. And so, all the consequences of inertia and ignorance, which belong to matter, are imposed on the life force and mind as it has emerged. And this is the materialized soul, Annamaya Purusha. For life in matter works in dependence on the body. Mind in matter works in dependence on the body and on the vital or nervous being. So you have had three layers. Within the body, life has come, it depends on the body. Mind has emerged, but dependent on the life and on the body. But the life itself on which it depends is life as organized in the body. So your nervous system, your chemicals, your hormones, and that's why you can take a pill and you have a boost of energy. And that's why you can inject with a certain chemical or hormone and suddenly you feel young and fresh. Inject something else and you go to sleep or you feel tired. It feels as if your mind is a product of biological processes because of this deep entanglement and dependence. And so, spirit itself in matter is limited and divided in its self relation and its powers by the limitations and divisions of this matter governed and life driven mind. So, if we have so far explored what happens to life and mind, the same thing happens to spirit. But now, if you see in this natural sequence, the consequences are spirit is dependent on the life driven mind and matter governed mind. Because just as mind emerged out of life force, spirit emerges out of mind but depends on this. Now, if your mind grew up with a certain rigidity, the spirit emerging out of mind is as if bound by the rigidity of its mental container, which is rigid because of the life energy being too attached, too narrow in its working, which is so because of the body being inflexible or not having adapted enough. You have a whole chain, and spirit feels as if bound to this chain. So sometimes you can have a person who may have a great experience of a free, liberated spiritual consciousness in meditation, and maybe a glow of that as he comes out of meditation. But then in his thinking, in his behavior, he may be the most narrow, the most opinionated, the most rigid. Why is that? Because he is embodied with all these limitations, and the expression of spirit is thus reduced. So, spirit itself in matter is limited and divided in its self relation and its powers. What does that mean? So, limited, we have seen, divided in its self relation and its powers. That is, when spirit knows itself, in the free consciousness, spirit knows itself, I am free, I am all powerful, I am all awareness, I am all delight. That's its relationship with itself. Now you bring the spirit into the physical, material world and body, and what happens? I am incapable. I am weak. I'm suffering. I need something which I'm missing. That's how it knows itself. So there is the division in the self relation. I don't have enough freedom. I don't have enough knowledge or power or joy. And if I don't have it, where is it? I must as if look outside myself. Perhaps I will get more joy if I do this. Perhaps I will gain more knowledge if I do that. Or perhaps I will be more powerful. It's all divided and cut up. When in fact the true nature of spirit is one whole, indivisible, infinite knowledge, awareness, power, delight. Now it's got broken up. So, spirit itself in matter is limited and divided in its self relation and its powers by the limitations and divisions of this matter governed and life driven mind. Because it's got plugged into this mind, life, all bound in matter, because it's all happening in the material world, everything has got reduced. This materialized soul lives bound to the body and its narrow, superficial, external consciousness. And it takes normally the experience of its physical organs, its senses, its matter bound life and mind, with at most some limited spiritual glimpses as the whole truth of existence. So, since we have even in our memory the sense that I am only born with the body, there is no memory beyond that. Even the birth is forgotten, but certainly there is no memory before that. And the sense that the memory will be lost after shedding of the body. So it's as if everything is bound, and this is the whole truth of my existence. But what are the other characteristics? He says, bound to the physical body, and its narrow, superficial, external consciousness. Three characteristics. It is narrow because it's only bound to me, little me of the body. Superficial, it does not know my own deeper ranges because the whole physical biology consciousness is only through the physical senses. One of the great questions the psychologists asked in the 1950s: what if all the senses feeding the brain were blocked? What will happen? The brain will suddenly go into chaos because there's no input feeding its data processing, right? And it'll begin to feed itself and wander off into madness. They actually believed that because they saw the brain as a machine which was led by the inputs coming in through the five senses, which are directing and feeding its processing. You cut that off, what will happen? The brain will feed upon its own imaginations and run away and become mad. Of course, none of that happens. In fact, one of the things which happens at that point, you find your consciousness not bound anymore by the brain. And you begin to experience even certain mystical states if you so choose. Otherwise, you just remain conscious that you're conscious with no particular inputs of senses. No big deal. Bound in body still. So, this surface part of the consciousness is all we know because it's plugged only in senses and defines itself by the senses and the response to senses. And the third character, he says, uh, narrow, superficial, external consciousness. We notice in our subjective experience that we can actually turn in and find deeper causes to our thought. While I'm normally living in the sense bound thought process, I can stop and ask, why am I on earth? Why did I take birth? Is there a purpose to my life? Is it by chance? And at that point, I'm not dependent on the senses. There is an inner range. And if I begin to live more and more in that, it's a whole new world that was waiting, of which I was not normally conscious because everything is in this narrow, superficial, external consciousness. And what experiences come with physical organs and senses and matter bound life and mind, with at most some limited spiritual glimpse. That is the whole truth of experience. What would be such a spiritual glimpse? I stood on the top of a mountain and I felt as if I was one with the sky. I lay down in the forest and I became one with the forest. That's a spiritual glimpse and a beautiful glimpse. But that's all. It stops there. I am this body which feels one with the whole forest. I feel for the forest. The forest cares for me. Stops there. It's still physical, and the band of reality is this physical. Man, now Sri Aurobindo shifts the perspective. This is what it feels like, but there is something else different which changes it all. Man is a spirit, but a spirit that lives as a mental being in physical nature. And so, because spirit has taken its stance first as mind, something changes in this whole experience. He is to his own self consciousness a mind in a physical body. So while I may feel or I may believe that I'm a product of my body, when I observe myself, I feel myself more mind than body. Because spirit took that poise. A monkey would not have that experience because in monkey the spirit has taken a different stance. In the plant, it would be a different stance of spirit. But in man, spirit has taken this poise of mind first. So he is to his own self consciousness a mind in a physical body. But at first, he is this mental being materialized. And he takes the materialized soul, Annamaya Purusha, for his real self. at first. Next, which we will see later, he has he has the power of self development. He can rise beyond these natural conceptions of the materialized soul. He can supplement them with a certain derivative experience drawn from supraphysical planes. But that will come later. First, he explores what is this material soul. But because we have the capacity, we do that also. But to appreciate the full sense of identification, he goes now to a very deep truth. See, so far in the whole description, it may seem as if this is unspiritual. It is limiting. Where is the spirituality in it? But keep in mind, all the long, it is spirit which has chosen to experience the material domain. And it is spiritual, it is experience of spirit as matter, in matter. And what's the secret behind it that he now reveals? He is obliged to accept, as the Upanishad expresses it, matter for the Brahman, because his vision here sees matter as that from which all is born, by which all lives, and to which all return in their passing. So the experience here is matter as Brahman, as the divine, as the all. And spirit has as if chosen, let me experience this. And that's what is the experience of the material world and us as individual souls in the material world. There's actually a spiritual dimension to this. And so the reference to the Upanishad is where in the Upanishad, the Rishi gives this exercise to the seeker. You want to know what is the Brahman, what is the ultimate and divine reality. Meditate on this. And what is it you meditate on? What is it from which everything emerges, that sustains everything, and into which everything flows back? Meditate on this, and you will discover the Brahman. It's a very interesting Upanishad because it takes you through 5 stages of discovery. In the first stage of this discovery, the disciple meditates, observes, goes into detail, notices that everything that exists, every experience, including our emotions, including our thoughts, including our highest fantasies or even glimpses of spirit, all are rooted in matter. Out of matter, all emerges. Because matter is sustaining, all is sustained, and into matter, all ends. So, even your highest spiritual experience, what do the scientists say? There is an activation of certain brain centers, as a result of which you feel dissociated from the body, you feel floating, you feel vast, you feel one with the universe, etc. You trigger that center, and suddenly your consciousness feels one with the universe. Isn't that great? And so, your spiritual experience is a product of matter. If I tickle another part of the brain, it shuts down or you become unconscious. Therefore, matter is reality. So he is obliged to accept, as the Upanishad expresses it, matter for the Brahman, because his vision here sees matter as that from which all is born, by which all lives, and to which all return in their passing. So the disciple comes to the Rishi and says, all matter is Brahman. And the Rishi says, wonderful, good, you have reached something great, but it's not enough. Go back and meditate deeper. So he goes back and goes deeper into his meditation. He comes to the conclusion that even all material processes are dependent on life force which drives the material process. It is the perception that energy is equal to mass multiplied by c square, E equals mc square, as they put it. Matter itself is nothing but an expression of energy. And it is the driving of energy that makes the material world itself possible, that makes all our processes possible. Our emotions and our thoughts and our spiritual experiences are driven by the life energy. So he comes back because all emerges from life, is sustained by life force, and returns to life force. And he says, Pranam Brahma. Life force is divine. And Rishi says it is a great achievement, but go deeper. And then he goes, discovers mind as the origin of all, because it is mind that guides life force. It is mind which initiates life force activity, sustains the flows of life force, and redirects, or it all lapses back into will of mind, power of mind, energy of mind. And so he comes back and says, Mana Brahman, mind is Brahman. And again he is sent back. A third time he goes, Vijnanam Brahma, the supermind is the creator. And a fifth is when he comes to the highest, which is the delight, Anandam Brahma, because even the supermind is only expressing the delight of creation, the delight of the divine. Now, in this whole story, it is the introspective process by which one discovers ultimate reality as if organized on five different levels. None of these contradicts the other, they complete each other. And of course, you may say the highest includes the lower ones, but the highest would be incomplete without matter being Brahman, also, isn't it? And matter as Brahman could not be without the highest poise of Brahman and all the intermediate steps. So, what you have as an experience is not that this was partial or wrong. They are all right. They are all stations that the divine takes for the purpose of the play. If it did not take the station of matter, then the possibility of distinct forms in which the delight plays out would not be. And so, the point of this sentence, when Sri Aurobindo quotes from the Upanishad, is to remind us that this is actually a stance that the Spirit has taken for a purpose. And it is divinity expressed, although initially in appearance of inertia and ignorance. But since Spirit has taken this poise, there is a deep reason, which later we will see towards the end of the chapter, that we discover behind all this, even in matter, is the supramental principle. It is the supermind guiding matter to move in certain rhythms that makes for the stability of the material world and gives to it its natural rhythms and forms, which we call laws of matter or physics or chemistry or biology. But when that supermind principle comes forward, which means what? Right now it is there, it puts forward a certain rhythm and itself does not involve in the rhythms. The rhythms are almost mechanical. So it seems as if the physical world is bound in the mechanism, is a machine, it's a giant clockwork. But when the supermind comes forward and exercises its freedom in the flow, then while still keeping the character of matter, it can express plasticity freely when it chooses, where it chooses. So let's say in the life force as organized in the plant, it is still the same matter as rock, but now freely expressing movement, flow, fluid, force. And same in our mind, in our brain, it is the same rock atoms organized to express something more. And if that supramental principle now comes forward and exercises itself through this biology, then it can exercise a plasticity and even reshape its operations as if reshaping the laws of physics in that space to express freely its will, which is what it is doing already in the operation of mind and life. In the first operations of life, it seems as if life is formed by matter, but in the advanced operations of life, life drives matter. You will and push your body, and you can push your body to do things which it could never have done of its own. So there's a reversal of the relationship, and the same with the mind. Mind can reprogram the body's habits, but supermind, now emergent and directly active, can imprint into matter new rhythms and new forms and new capacities which earlier could not be. You could not have imagined looking at rock that something like the perfume and subtlety of flower would be possible out of those molecules. You cannot imagine that one day substance would become superconscious, supramental, and the body plastic at will. And remember what we said earlier, as a result of the plasticity, no need for aging. Aging happens only because of the rigidity, inability to keep up with the demand of plasticity. But with a supramentalized physical body, it is completely plastic and yet fluid and yet extremely strong and resilient. The supramental fist would be able to hit a rock, and if it so choose, be able to shatter the rock if it wants, because it can be stronger than the rock. And yet it can be fluid enough and soft enough to lift the flower and perhaps even shape itself a little bit to adjust the form as necessary. And the substance itself would be not only conscious but expressing the delight of the Ananda of Satchidananda in the substance. As it touches flower, finger which feels itself infinite would meet infinity of flower and enjoy the delight of the divine meeting the divine in the body, in the substance, in the cells of the body itself, in the tissue of the body itself. And this we can conceive of, we can begin to glimpse logically when you take this sequence through to completion. But right now, that supramental power is still held behind, not overt, not active, not asserting itself, allowing rather its organized play of rigidity and resistance, inertia of matter to be the dominant character. But when it reveals, it will still use the rigidity and resistance to hold form, but not be bound by rigidity and resistance. It will freely exercise its choice of plasticity. So, this is very important that matter will not cease to be matter. It will still be matter, but now able to express freely divinity. Why is this important? Because domain of matter is created for the divine expression. It is not to be abandoned, it is not to be destroyed or dissolved. It is meant to be fulfilled and made divine and perfect. And the same for the other domains, making all the way up to the highest in the supramental and in the bliss body. And all these together forming 5 layers will be the full human divinized being. And such a being would live in the physical body, in the vital body, in the mental body, in the supramental body, and in the Satchidananda body, bliss body, and simultaneously on all these planes. Just as today you live in your world of thought as much as your world of emotion, as much as your world of body, physical body, isn't it? But if you're more identified with physical body, your thoughts are somewhat abstract. If you live fully in the mind awareness, your physical world is formed by your thoughts and your conceptions. And you can modulate where you put your focus. But with the full supramentalization, you will have access to all these domains, live on these different planes, experience things of those planes at the same time while expressing in the physical plane, which is intended to express divinity also. And that's why this is so important. Annam Brahma, matter is Brahman, as the first realization. But we do not see the Brahman, we see it as if concealed behind processes. But one day it can also reveal Brahman while still remaining matter. So Sri Aurobindo makes reference to the Upanishad and later again with the life force and mind similarly. His natural highest concept of spirit is an infinite. Now, being in the physical and identified with the limiting physical, what do you look at? What is spiritual? What is spirit to you? Anything which goes beyond the boundaries of physical, which is what? Limitation and inertia. What is that? Infinite. Infinity is how you conceive of spirit. Preferably an inconscient infinite, inhabiting or pervading the material universe, which alone it really knows, and manifesting by the power of its presence all these forms around him. So, this is our conception of the spiritual. There's an infinity. It's filling the whole universe. Isn't that how you would conceive of spirit? How will you visualize spirit? It's like a rarefied gas which is filling everything. It's inside everything. It's equally inside the flower, inside my hand, inside the earth. But you're picturing it almost like an etheric substance filling everything. Infinite, of course. Inconscient, preferably, because it can't be alive, it can't be conscious, at least not to our first perception. If it is conscious, then we wonder, why isn't it doing something? It must be mechanical, but some presence. And inhabiting or pervading the material universe, which is all you know, and manifesting by the power of its presence all these forms around him. Because spirit is inside the earth, it somehow pushes molecules to form the plant, and out of plant puts out flower. Because spirit is inside even my body, it nudges the electrical signals and molecules to create ripples of thought and so on. But it is as if a secret power behind appearances. But it is material also. You see, in a perception of spirit, it has a material character. This is what the scientist conceives of. They discard the word God or spirit, but their concept of ultimate reality is what? Because anyway, you go to the Upanishadic exercise, where does it all come from? What does it return to? What sustains it? Scientists will say energy. What is this energy? It has no form. Where is it? It's everywhere. Is it more here and less there? No, it is equally everywhere. And what does it do? Well, it makes for the atoms to exist. How? Because it is constantly seething and fluctuating, throwing virtual particles without which the atom couldn't survive. So you have a picture of some equally spread out power, unconscious, but which is energetic, which causes everything to happen. It is infinite. And all the forms are the result of it. That's God. That's spirit as matter, in matter. So the scientist will avoid those words, but his concept of ultimate reality is this: spirit as matter. And so his natural highest conception of himself. Now here you are an individual identified with body. What am I? What is the highest I am or can be? So his natural conception of himself is a vaguely conceived soul or spirit, a soul manifested only by the physical life's experience, bound up with physical phenomena, and forced on its dissolution to return by an automatic necessity to the vast indeterminateness of the infinite. Somehow, I was born with the body. When the body dies, I will somehow merge back into something, and that is soul, that is spirit. But what is it inside meanwhile? It is manifested only by the physical life's experiences, bound up with physical phenomena. So if this cell in the body was not fertilized, the soul would never get a chance to take birth. And there are people who actually have this problem, that every cell in the body which could have taken birth but was not fertilized is a soul that didn't have a chance to take birth. And they feel so guilty about it. And there's a whole complex then social behavior built around that idea. On the other hand, somebody just died, he died, his soul, well, goes back into, he's everywhere. What's the form it takes in many of the cruder traditions of spirituality? They'll say he joins with the earth, he merges with the wind, or he's now living among the stars. So the sense of immersion in something indeterminate, formless, and still you have to have a physical relation. Stars become the sense of infinity, eternity, and it's all there. Nothing is gone. You will remember the same idea represented in a movie which is called Avatar. So when people die, their souls are absorbed into the planetary consciousness, of which there's a special tree that represents it. And so the beings of this planet, they plug into the tree and they hear the voices of all their ancestors. You never really go away. You kind of join into this indeterminate mass. But if the tree was not there, it would not have a chance to express itself. But it would still be there somehow, somewhere. We don't know where. You see, all of this, the way he describes it, is how human beings think about it. In the religions they form when identified with the physical body and the physical world alone. So his natural conception of himself is a vaguely conceived soul or spirit. Can you describe to me exactly what you mean by I am a soul? Well, there's this kind of separate awareness that I have. It's a vague form. That's about all you can do. But it's bound to physical phenomena. But because he has the power of self development, he can rise beyond these natural conceptions of the materialized soul. This is where we begin. What happens when we rise above? He can supplement them with a certain derivative experience drawn from supra-physical planes and worlds. So you might have a derivative experience that you say, you know what, like in a dream state, I can float around, I can have a body, I can meet people. So after I die, maybe I live on in some subtle body. That's a derivative experience. We derived from something which you glimpsed while in the physical domain. Or make it a little more complex. So as I'm floating around, because I can fly, throw in a couple of wings to explain how I can fly. And if I'm floating, where do I go? High up among the clouds. So you picture a heaven with clouds and flying beings with wings. You're deriving, building on elements which you had experienced while in the physical identification. Or he can concentrate in mind and develop the mental part of his being, usually at the expense of the fullness of his vital and physical life. And in the end, the mind predominates and can open to the beyond. So, this is what happens now in the elite of those who seek a higher spiritual or even a mental life. So, even if you seek a higher mental life, what happens is you get into a philosophical, speculative awareness. Or as a scientist, you get into an abstraction of what I am and develop something which now completely dissociates from this physical experience. But its character is that the world no more becomes important, or it becomes almost like an illusion. This domain of thought and idea is my reality. And you will see in many of the spiritual practices of many traditions, and particularly the ascetic ones, the entire focus of self absorption into mind is the way by which you disconnect from the world and from your own body and surface parts in order to turn away into something which is beyond, not physical world. What is the beyond then? Can't describe, can't explain, because you still defined yourself in terms of the material world and material soul consciousness. So, although you've separated into mind, you were still looking at the whole reality from the matter perspective. And so, there's a beyond, indescribable. He can concentrate this self liberating mind on the spirit. Here, too, usually in the process, he turns away more and more from his full mental and physical life. He limits or he discourages their possibilities as much as his material foundation in nature will allow him. So you see, the ascetic stops exercising the body, stops eating too much food, reducing, minimizing until only that life, that reality remains. There are many traditions where people go into cave retreats or now dark room retreats for months on end. Why? You're shutting out the physical world, absorbed in this mental and perhaps turning mind to spirit, some sense of beyond. Everything weakens on the surface then. You see now the problem. If at all from there you access a higher spiritual domain, it does not have a vehicle to express in life. In fact, the world itself has become to it meaningless or illusory, unimportant. So he says, even when you develop this intellect so much, your vital and physical nature tends to weaken. You notice people like that who live so much in their thoughts, the physical body tends to become also more vulnerable or oversensitive. And all of this is not acceptable in the integral yoga. While you may choose momentarily to withdraw for a purpose, but you have to bring back, you have to strengthen not only the mind, the vital, and the physical to make them fit instruments to manifest the divine. In the end, his spiritual life predominates, destroys his earthward tendency, and breaks its ties and limitations. Spiritualized, he places his real existence beyond, in other worlds, in the heavens of the vital or mental plane. Interesting. You've not gone into some great spiritual domain of the upper hemisphere. Because in the very act of this, you broke away from the physical consciousness by a means which was a mental, and so entered the vital or mental planes. And they can be extremely beautiful, extremely heavenly. They have their own infinities, but not of the nature of the spiritual infinities. And live there. And that's why you have many heavens to explore there. Spiritualized, he places his real existence beyond, in other worlds, in the heavens of the vital or mental plane. He begins to regard life on earth as a painful or troublesome incident or passage in which he can never arrive at any full enjoyment of his inner ideal self, his spiritual essence. So, as long as I have this experience of the inner self or ideal or presence of something spiritual cut off from the world, that I cannot have here. If I'm bound here, that gets dulled, weakened, or lost. But if I am there, then this becomes a temporary transitional passage. So one day the body will be dropped. What's the big deal? Meanwhile, I do whatever minimum is required to get on with whatever responsibilities come my way. But you cannot have the enjoyment of that here, nor the power of that here, nor the knowledge of that here, nor the full force and consciousness. Moreover, his highest conception of the spirit, of the self or spirit, is apt to be more or less quietistic. For, as we have seen, it is the static infinity alone that he can entirely experience. So, what is the spirituality you came to? Silence, emptiness, blank, nothing, peace, nirvana, self extinction, whatever terms you may give, but it is always quietistic. For it is its static infinity alone that he can entirely experience the still freedom of Purusha, unlimited by Prakriti, the soul standing back from nature. That was the whole means, isn't it? You separated awareness from identification with the physical world. And so you stood back, and the silence of Purusha is all that remains. There may come indeed some divine dynamic manifestation in him, but it cannot rise entirely above the heavy limitations of physical nature. So once in a while, this saint is inspired, there's a problem, something flows through him, and a miracle is performed, or an intervention done, or a stream of knowledge pours out in his commentary on a sacred text, or he reveals some sacred knowledge, and then goes back to the quietistic state. Occasionally, in his presence, you feel a kind of an elevated joy and delight, but again in stillness, in silence. What flows through still has to struggle with the limitation of the physical nature. That has not changed. The peace of the silent and passive self is more easily attainable, and he can more easily and fully hold it. Too difficult for him is the bliss of an infinite activity, the dynamis of an immeasurable power. Interesting. We don't think of it in this way because so much of the traditional spirituality has aimed at the ascetic stillness and silence. He says it's difficult to gain the other aspect, which is bliss of an infinite activity, which is the nature of the upper hemisphere. Infinite delight, infinite power pouring out unendingly, blissfully. Can such a thing be experienced by him or realized in his life? The dynamics of an immeasurable power, when there is a power, capital P, the creative power of the divine pouring out into the whole universe. What do you see? And even in physical ways, what do you see? The Big Bang is how the science conceives of it. Enormous explosion, all that you see in the universe, the trillions and trillions of galaxies having themselves billions of stars and having themselves everything else, all that bursting out in one gigantic explosion. And then what do you see? Supernovas, an entire star exploding, and the enormous energy of its power. Not recognizing that all this is part of the play of the delight of seething creative energy constantly bursting out, unendingly. Look at the simple experience of our sun, the intensity of light that it puts out, the intensity of energy and forces that it pours out. There is what we call a solar wind, which is what? Substance of the sun being thrown out at enormous velocity, that it comes from the sun to us in a matter of a few minutes or hours at most, and it hits the earth with such a blast that if we didn't have a strong magnetic field, the blast would scorch the earth, burn away all life. And the magnetic field is what protects. Even that comes under pressure of the blast. The magnetic field is pushed back against the earth and forms a long ovoid stretched. What was roundish, it gets stretched, pulled back with the force of this blast of the solar wind. And every now and then there are gigantic solar flares which can come and smash everything. The magnetic field may protect life here, but it is not enough to protect your electronics. The huge variations of electrical and magnetic voltages will be so high, the electronics in your mobile phone will be fried because of the electricity that it will induce by fluctuations up there around the earth. All your electronics will be gone by one solar blast hitting the earth directly. What kind of a humongous power exists? And this is tiny earth of a blast which is so big, whoop, going across it. What kind of a power is being thrown out from the sun every moment in all directions? And if you really entered the experience of it, it would be the delight of that dynamics of an immeasurable power pouring itself out. And each sun, each galaxy, everywhere in the universe is just that. And all we see is only one tiny part of it. There are many more frequencies and higher ranges of material which are thrown out with greater force and violence. So, too difficult for him is the bliss of an infinite activity, the dynamics of an immeasurable power. What does he live in is this peace of the silent and passive self, easily attainable and more easily and fully held on to. If you see the way he has described it, straight away you realize you have only caught one aspect of the spirit. There's a whole other aspect which is completely ignored or too difficult to reach. Is it possible to reach that? Is it possible to experience that? Is it possible to live in that while in the physical body? And we will see yes, and we have seen the logic of it already. But living, identifying with the physical body as your soul, as your reality, you cannot reach that. With that identification comes this limitation. Now we will shift from here to the next level of identification. But the spirit can be poised in the principle of life, not in matter. The spirit so founded becomes the vital self or of a vital world, the life soul of a life energy in the reign of a consciously dynamic nature. Now the picture suddenly changes. Remember, in the physical world, it was God has wound up a clock and now everything is moving automatically. Atoms are bouncing, molecules are forming. It's one machine. But from the life perspective, what is it? Energy, seething energy, bouncing, jumping, randomly moving around. And that's what you see in quantum physics a little bit. Everything is somehow compelled by chance events behind the appearance. But what is the chance event driven by? Energy. What is the energy doing? How much energy? Infinite. And this is the problem of quantum physics, that if you really face the reality of a single particle, it has infinite energy. Or a simple single chunk of empty space has infinite energy. So, in order to be able to manipulate particles and equations, you cut off upper frequencies and lower frequencies, reduce it to a finite quantity, and even that is a humongous energy. And so you can measure a particle interacting with a particle. But the reality of it in the pure physics is infinite energy as particle meeting infinite energy as particle. And something in their interaction is so unpredictable as to be nearly random. And you measure the randomness more or less. And so the picture changes and becomes an enormous dynamic flow of energy, ocean of energy flowing, churning, seething. A reign of a consciously dynamic nature. But we have shifted our poise now to life force, not matter. And from life force, we can see as if matter is formed by life force. This is the greater reality. Absorbed in the experiences of the power and play of a conscious life, it is dominated by the desires, activity, and passion of the Rajasic principle proper to vital existence. So here we took example of the physical energy, but this is really prana, life force, of which physical energy is a tiny part. The life force itself is what we experience in our emotions and desires and all the activities and passions which drive these activities. And so that becomes now our reality. What am I? I am this life force. I am its play and its dynamism and passion. In the individual, this spirit becomes a vital soul, pranamaya purusha, of the nature of prana, in whose nature the life energies tyrannize over the mental and physical principles. Suddenly the picture changes now. The life energy is like a tyrant, dominating the physical and the mental and pushing them to do what it wants. And so the physical element in a vital world readily shapes its activities and formations in response to desire and its imaginations. So the whole relationship now tilts. This dominates, physical world plays along, mental world plays along, life force is the hub of the play of reality. So he continues, which we will see later. But this shows you how dramatically the whole scene changes as you shift from one level to another. Similarly, when you shift to the mental, it will be as dramatic or more dramatic a change. When you shift from there to the supramental, it will be even more radical in change. But these three lower we can understand. When we shift to the supramental, the mind says, infinities, I can't make sense of it. Because we are still in mind. And we have not even gone into the higher ranges of mind. So then he will say, all right, let's prepare the mind to understand better, at least in the higher parts of our mind, what is this supramental domain like? And from there, how the whole reality is experienced. And that becomes the theme of the next chapter called Vijnana or Gnosis. So we have a big picture now of what he's doing in this chapter and where it is all leading to. And we will study the rest of the text in our next session, which will be after a long gap. We will take this up. Unfortunately, we will not be able to meet the whole of March. The 4 Fridays we will miss. And we will continue this April 3rd onwards. But for now, the big picture is there. We will try to retain this. We explored in depth the physical world. We got a first glimpse of the vital world. And now we can see how the shift of station to the mental and the supramental will change equally. But they will form a cohesive continuum. And from the supramental will be the power to bring the upper hemisphere into the lower and to lift the lower into the upper. And the fullness of spirit across both hemispheres will then be revealed and experienced without limitations. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions.
I remember that Nicholas Tesla said, if you want to speak about the universe, you need to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Can you dwell upon these three elements?
Yes. So the physics of today is largely based on matter as Brahman. When we can recognize that life force is Brahman, then the nature of the physics will change. We will, instead of seeing matter as little particles in an empty space, we will see space itself filled with this humongous energy. And then anywhere in space, you can tune in and tap this energy and activate it. And you have infinite energy everywhere. Equally, we will see particles of matter not only forming but behaving according to the energy flows. So, by manipulating the energy flows, we will be able to modify matter, materialize matter, dematerialize matter, or transmute matter. So, the whole of the physics itself will change from this shift of perspective. Of course, it will naturally then recognize also mind is Brahman, mana Brahman. If it takes that poise, then with the power of the mind's intervention, you will be able to create and materialize. So many of the rishis were of this order that they could actually conceive of something and then bring it into manifestation and actualize it. But the whole science changes perspective. And as a science, it is far greater. Once you have reached, let's say, even the life force as the basis of science, the current exaggerated focus on particles and their fine processes seems to be almost silly. When I don't need to understand all those laws, when I can change them at will by an exercise of force or will, isn't it? So that's the reason why in the ancient times, although the rishis had developed technologies greater than what we have today, they found it not so interesting to explore matter in itself and neglected that. And that is what current science and modern technology is doing by its exaggerated obsession with matter as reality. So, in a sense, you can say, in the larger scope of the evolutionary exploration, this exaggerated materialism has served a purpose to explore possibilities of matter in itself, separate from life force and mind. And of course, that has wonderful secrets to be discovered.
You said that supramental plane is always be with us, but it was working through different planes of consciousness, so that is why it was this story.
Yes.
And in 1956, this symbol of this experience of the body is a golden hammer should create a direct bridge to matter.
So, what she did was not to create a bridge, but to release the supramental consciousness and force to flood the lower hemisphere as a force of evolution.
Directly of this feeling.
Yes, 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 the whole of the lower hemisphere is filled with it.
But if the supernatural plane was always there,
Yes.
we cannot imagine creation without it.
Yes, so it is always there, but like I said, it puts forward a certain rhythm but does not involve itself in the rhythm. So the appearance is of a mechanical rhythm. When it comes forward and involves itself in the rhythm, it can change the rhythm which it created. And so there you have the revealed play of the supramental freedom to do what it wants. When it stays behind and simply releases the movements, then it seems as if the movement is only mechanical. Okay. So what she did was to break this, let's say, gate, the door, which prevented that higher consciousness from directly flowing down. She broke that because in evolution that stage had arrived. Before that, it was premature. Just as if you see the earth evolution, as the animal gradations grew up to the ape, let's say, mind as a power of thought, individualized and organized in evolution, was not yet there. There was always mind. Mind is there even inside matter, in the perfect design of the crystal structure, for example. It's an reducible to a formula, such as the mind there. But it's not thinking mind, it is not conscious, it's not self conscious mind. To organize that, it needed a strong influence of the mental consciousness working in evolution, helping to develop in the brain the capacity to embody mind. So that also happened at a certain stage in evolution. Once that is there, everything in the universe now begins to receive more directly the pressure of mind. So something like that has happened now. Everything on all planes in the universe is receiving the pressure of the supramental consciousness. Not necessarily its direct action, but its pressure for things to change and move as it wants, but without breaking.
And before there was no pressure.
There was not this kind of pressure in evolution, in active evolution. It was there as a support, as a creative power, but not involved in the play. Once that happens, it is an action for the whole universe. It's not just physical earth. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that the supramental action in the human physical body, for example, the bringing of the supramental consciousness in the physical cells, is something which has not been done before. Because if it had been done, then the imprint of that effort would be there in the cosmic consciousness. So when he's saying this, he is not speaking of the earth alone, but of all the planets where evolution has taken place. So there are planets where beings have evolved not only to the level of intellect we have, but much more. Beings which have evolved even into higher spiritual states than we have. But without this power being brought into the physical body and the physical consciousness. It is similar to what the Vedic rishis had, where they entered states of the supramental consciousness, entered the supramental worlds, but that was not brought and fixed in the physical consciousness. The body was there only as a support for their physical existence, and that's it. This work of fixing into matter is something new, never done before, and it has been done only in these last, let's say, 100 years.
Is it connected with psychic somehow? Like when something is born on Earth, is readiness for the supernatural power. Is it connected with this psychic emerging?
The emergence and evolution of the psychic being was always there in the evolution. That is, at first, there is the psychic, let's say, principle or the psychic consciousness in a general way, unformed, not individualized. But as physical forms evolve with greater individualization, there is an opportunity for the psychic to form an individualized soul. In the beginning, it may take a more group form, a family of animals, but eventually it individualizes sufficiently that you can distinguish the behavior of one as separate from another. That individualization takes place, and you see that in the more sophisticated animals. But in the evolution of the soul, the psychic being itself, it goes through a physical individualization, a vital emotional individualization, and then a mental individualization. It's as if developing these as powers of itself. And in the human being, in most developed cases in the human being, it has come to an individualized mental consciousness. But its evolution now includes developing higher powers or gradations of consciousness in its individualization, organizing them around this central divine principle. And that's the true evolution of the psychic being. Parallel to this is the outer evolution of the biology and psychology of the surface nature. So there are two evolutions going on. The surface, we use the word vehicle, in which the psychic being is residing. That has to grow so that the psychic can act through it. Otherwise, if my intelligence is not developed, the psychic feels I'm not able to express thought. So it should grow. But equally, the psychic has to grow to access higher possibilities and organize them in order to be able to manifest them. So there's a double evolution, which in the supramental consciousness actually joins. It is the psychic being itself which joins with the material of nature, which becomes, materializes as the physical body and nature. And so the two join at some point. But initially, they are two different things. Yes.
Which Upanishad are we talking about? Is it the Taittiriya Upanishad?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, nice. I was just reading that and it's not discussing similar as well. And this Avatar movie is the one we talked about, the recent animation one by a director called Cameron.
Yes, that's right.
And the last thing I want to say is we talked about people get these higher powers and if they misuse them, they can lose them kind of thing, right? We said at one point. Is it something like that story of that Rishi Durga stuff down that? It is something that was somebody
So I was not speaking of misuse. I was just saying that the experience which is had in a higher state does not translate into a change in their thought and emotions or even physical behavior or instincts, because that is still bound to the biology machinery. Because the person is still embedded more there than on a higher status. If you had, for example, shifted your center of identification from body to mental body, mental sheath, okay? At that point, any spiritual experience you have will change your way of thinking. But if your mental sheath is still plugged into the physical and a product of the biological limits, then that change will still struggle through a limited mind. This is unfortunately the case in many of the ascetic traditions, where in order to pursue this kind of a spirituality beyond, you neglected all that development. And or at best, you used a strong intellectual development as a way of breaking out of mind to convince mind that there's no point in making an effort outward, just go in. A lot of the ascetics do that. They go through a philosophy that says, well, world is illusion, I have understood now, so now let me stop bothering with it and turn away. But in all this, you have left the whole machinery exactly as it is, bound and fixed in matter as your first basis of reality. And that's why you are unchanged. That's why the previous chapter, you will recall, the whole thrust of that was to be able to shift from this center of identification with the physical body to the vital body and then the mental body, and being able to live more and more in the mental sheath itself. If we have done that, then all this which he is describing now can be put into practice as we read. If we have not done that, then it is still something to be worked upon as we become more free in the mental consciousness. Our normal popular conception of spirituality is very mixed, very blurred. Oh, he has reached a high consciousness. Now everything else must become automatically divine. No, it doesn't. When the person comes out of that high consciousness, he may come back into a mind body personality which is still extremely egoistic or impulsive or angry or whatever distortions of the nature would be there, because it was never taken into the experience, or the experience was never brought into this layer. And so they remain two worlds separate. So this is, in many ways, the most important chapter. We can say that of each chapter, but in the sequence, the most important because it introduces to us this principle of the supramental, which will link the upper and the lower hemispheres and make possible the descent of the upper and the ascent of the lower, giving you the full experience of spirit and the full expression of spirit in a revealed play of divinity. And it is towards this that our whole human evolution, human spiritual evolution has been working, for which Sri Aurobindo and the Mother incarnated as the avatar of the supramental age, of the supramental consciousness. Each avatar brings a new layer, a new level of consciousness and fixes it in evolution as an active force. The last great in the sequence was where Rama and Krishna, Rama establishing the sattvic mind, after which you see everywhere on earth the norm is to live by higher ethical values, higher standards of understanding and thought, and so on. Without that, we were still living by values which were still semi animal. Shri Krishna brings in the over mental principle, after which you see this outburst of so many religious forms, which each represent an aspect of the over mental consciousness, a way of relating to the divine through the heart, through the mind, through the whole being turned in relationship with that which is a being, conscious divinity. And that sets the preparation for a final joining, which requires a higher than mind consciousness and the supramental consciousness which unites the two hemispheres. And so, as happens with every avatar, in the lifetime of the avatar, the work is done for humanity, but humanity may not recognize it. Today, we can look back and say the incarnation of Rama had this enormous impact, whose effect is still there today. The manifestation of Sri Krishna had this impact. But during his lifetime, the only thing probably they saw, here's a great king, he seems to have some unusual powers and a very magnetic personality, and somehow he made the whole Mahabharat war happen, but we don't know how exactly he did it. He seemed to be controlling everything somehow behind the scenes. But something changed with his coming. And if there was not the Bhagavad Gita which was revealed, you might never know what he actually did or what he taught or what he represented. There, through that, it got as if expressed in the form of a teaching. And in the same way with Sri Aurobindo's work, if he had not written all these books, you might never know in mental terms, and yet the work would have been done. Since he has written it, and it was necessary perhaps for humanity also to understand and put it into practice through an understanding, and to bring together all of the human knowledge gathered, lift it to its highest possibility to join with its source in a supramental knowledge. So we have like as if a first entry or a stairway of writings which can take us all the way up to whatever the highest our mind is capable of. But even without all that, the work would have been done. But with that, we have the advantage that we can understand, and through the mind and the heart and our actions consciously participate in this effort of joining, to open to the supramental consciousness and also to receive its influence to whatever extent we are capable of receiving it. And so it is in this sense that we can prepare ourselves for tomorrow. Oui.
I want to tell something in agenda 1972 Mother, 16 February 1972, Mother of a Vision, 50 years after 2022, all of the world in the sky. So, I touched Madame
Yes.
recently
Yes.
the class of solitude.
Yes.
And it's very, very, very
Yes. Something Mother said around 1972 that in 50 years that the world will understand Sri Aurobindo. Of course, it doesn't mean that everybody on earth will know, and it doesn't mean 50 years exactly to the date, but the idea is that exactly. Yes, yes.
50 years,
Yes. Yes, 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 yes. So, in the larger movement of evolution, the action of the avatar is to imprint in humanity on many levels. And here, in this case, the supramental consciousness down to the most physical level, but also in the mind of humanity and in the heart, in the life energies. And the result is there is naturally and almost spontaneously a change in thinking in the mass. And whatever variations individually, but in the mass, there is a thinking which is much more universal, much more global, much more inclusive, much more multifaceted, and so on, which is the result of that action. Because if you see, before or after that action, nothing changed in the actual methodology and content of teachings, nothing changed in the actual government and its structures, nothing changed in the prime drivers of industry or life interests of people. And yet, the way people think changed for no other reason than the action of the imprint made by this supramental work, action on humanity and the mind of humanity. So, in a sense, we can say, and that's how we understand the mother's observations, that it will happen in spite of humanity. But if we participate, the whole process can enormously speed up and happen in an awakening of joy to greater joy. If we do not participate, she said, it will be through the pressure of crashing circumstances that the change is compelled on humanity. And so it is either that you consciously open your mind and open it to infinity, or at least plastic, wider, higher, or suddenly you have a series of blows from contradictory compulsions and ideas which shatter the rigidity and narrowness of your mind, and you're stunned into opening to something wider, but through much pain, through much struggle. But still, the opening will take place. So, if we understand the direction of evolution, and this understanding comes from our study here, if we understand that, we can participate in it and therefore speed it up. And even as we read, allow that influence and action of his experience to lift us. So we can use this as a help, and even in our, as I said, in our preparation for tomorrow, if we dwell on the theme, dwell on our relationship with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And the mother, not only in the form in which we know physically, but as the supramental Shakti of the divine. And open ourselves to her, invoking her to prepare us and to fill and lift us into that which is necessary for our evolution. And concentrate on this theme as we chant Om. Om.